I once overheard a conversation about Halloween 3, the Season of the Witch, at a horror convention between two men in their mid to late 40s. They couldn't understand how or why Halloween 3 was so popular. They were talking about how only the hipster millennials were the ones who liked it, because back when it was released, in 1982, it was despised. These two men didn't just talk about how bad it was because it lacked Michael Myers, but that even without him, it's still a bad movie. Listening to this conversation made me think about this movie because, well, I actually like it, though I wouldn't really consider myself a hipster, but there is something special to it, you can't deny that. Whether or not you like it is subjective, and there's no denying that it is a cult classic. So the point of this video is to explain why it's a cult classic. And though the reasons I'm going to give can relate to a lot of 80s horror movies, keep Halloween 3 in mind for most of it. First, and it's pretty obvious that this is the main reason why a lot of 80s action and horror movies and other cheesy-like movies are still popular and considered cult classics is because of the rise of VHS tapes and cable. To younger people, these two words can seem very outdated, and it can be hard to imagine life decades before you were even born, but just pretend for a moment. Cable television was around for a long time, but didn't quite become mainstream until the mid-70s. VHS tapes were invented in the late 70s, but it didn't hit mainstream audiences until the 80s. You get where I'm going with this? With more homes accessing cable television, children were growing up with all sorts of programs and movies. And back then, parents weren't as strict with what they allowed their children to watch. Today, there's so many different types of parental controls and such. Back then, parents saw something like RoboCop and figured it was a children's movie.
Don't touch me, man!
Today, we have the internet and access to any information at all. Back then, there was very little information to go by. You'd take a gamble and risk 2 hours of your day to find out if a movie was even going to be good. Now, cable may have censored some movies, but HBO certainly didn't. And looking back at some of these other B movies, they didn't have a big budget or anything, but they're still loved because, well, nostalgia is a major factor, but also it's what was on TV. In today's world, movies very rarely become cult classics because there are far too many options available. All the different streaming services and different ways you can watch movies. TV was limited to a couple dozen channels, and the only other option really was to watch a VHS tape. You'd go to a video store and look at the cover, maybe read the description on the back, and that's it. I remember my older brother telling me once that he rented Rocky Horror Picture Show because it was in the horror section of a video store. He had no idea what it was about, and well, it definitely wasn't what he expected, but still loved it. That happened a lot. So maybe when Halloween 3 was released on VHS, people were attracted because it had that familiar title, and the cover art looks pretty cool. Sure, most people probably hated it after watching it, because, like I mentioned, no Michael Myers, but a lot of people still watched it. It was also on television back in the day as well. So with these very limited options for people in the 80s, a lot of movies became beloved, and today, many of them perhaps didn't age well, but others look past those flaws and enjoy it for what they are, mainly because it's what they watched as children. Second, let's talk about the movie itself. Let's look past the whole no Michael Myers situation, because that's been talked about to death. The movie promises a premise about Halloween, the actual holiday. The whole story builds up to Halloween, and the Season of the Witch subtitle plays a major role as well in the story. So yeah, spoilers, the movie does not have a happy ending, and that's pretty refreshing. A lot of times, even in horror movies, they have happy endings. Halloween 3 doesn't only have a quote-unquote bad ending, but hundreds, thousands, even perhaps millions of children get killed, presumably. You see, these Halloween masks have a very special power gathered from Stonehenge that somehow this guy here, Colonel Cochran, manifested and installed into each mask using a special chip. The entire movie builds up anticipation for what will happen on Halloween due to a Silver Shamrock Halloween commercial that continually plays out.
Canon, one of the big Halloween 3. That's right, 3 horrific masks to choose from.
There's a message here about propaganda and television in general. Like I mentioned, this was around the time that children were glued to their televisions because of cable and VHS tapes. And well, I suppose this movie is reflecting on that. Anyway, the hero, I guess Dr. Chalice here, is attempting to thwart Colonel Cochran's plans, but ultimately he fails. And so all the children who were told by the commercials to watch with their masks on die, though it isn't shown. We see what exactly happens when a kid watches the commercial with the mask on earlier in the film. He dies brutally. Didn't see that much then, maybe outside of Toxic Avenger. The movie doesn't have a lot of deaths, and it isn't overly gory, but the imagery is shocking at times and definitely memorable. Original Halloween director John Carpenter didn't direct it. A friend of his did. In fact, it was the first movie he ever directed, Tommy Wallace. Carpenter did compose the music, and dare I say it's his best soundtrack? It's my favorite, at least. It's very menacing and atmospheric, like most of his soundtracks. And the Halloween jingle is catchy, of course, though many people hate it.
In 4 days to Halloween, Halloween, Halloween. In 4 days to Halloween, Silver Shamrock.
The two main actors in this movie are accomplished actors, but certainly are not the types you'd imagine in an 80s horror movie. Usually they resemble something like this or this, but definitely not this. It's a quirky movie, very different than anything before it, no slasher, and instead we get these corporate robots, literally. Not very scary, but perhaps it's an allusion to corporations in general, which can indeed be scarier than any slasher villain. I can imagine Halloween fans were disappointed when watching this, but children watching it when it was released, it was probably terrifying, since, they are the target audience for the Halloween holiday. I think the TV commercial and the ending are what lasted with viewers. Another reason why Halloween 3, and perhaps many other horror movies from the 80s, are amongst the most loved in the entire horror genre, the practical effects. Hear me out on this one. At this time, people were beginning to use special effects with computers, like we saw in Blade Runner or Star Wars movies. It was very minimal, of course, but for the most part, these effects were all practical and mostly camera tricks. You don't see this level of creativity anymore, though there are a special few like The Void. A lot of out-of-this-world concepts and ideas are probably not possible through the use of practical effects, but then again, check out Dark Crystal and Labyrinth. There really is no excuse if the budget is there not to use practical effects. Though I'm not a movie maker, so who knows why most movies today are just CGI messes. This movie came out just a year ago, and don't tell me you'd rather see this than this, because I don't believe that. Now, if you compare that to some other movies in the past few years, no one even talks about them anymore. All of that being said, Halloween 3 fits that cult classic niche. The fact that it was despised can play a major role too. Many movies that are bashed by critics and audiences often become classics later on, even if they did bomb in theaters. Now, there is also the factor of the so bad it's good type of movie. You see that with the likes of Troll 2, Silent Night, Deadly Night 2, Ninja 3, and so on. But is Halloween 3 so bad it's good? I don't know. The acting can be bad at times, but everyone seems to forgive the numerous Friday the 13th movies despite being attached to a classic hit. You can take some factors into consideration: the great soundtrack, the unique concept, the bad ending, the cool masks, all the great stuff. And then there's the so-called villains, and the main roles are a little goofy. The lack of Michael Myers, you can take those into consideration as cons, but the pros outweigh them here. It's obvious, very obvious, and has been said numerous times before. If the movie didn't have the Halloween connection, people wouldn't have hated it as much. Though, yes, online, people say that despite it being called Halloween, it's still a bad movie, but read those reviews, most of them complain that it doesn't have Michael Myers, so their opinions are null. Whether you're laughing at the awful villains, the questionable acting at times, or maybe you hate that commercial jingle, either way, it's evoking some sort of emotion and isn't completely forgettable like a lot of movies are today.
Stop it! Stop it!